What if you were granted the one thing humanity has chased for centuries, the ultimate power, the answer to every material worry you've ever had? What if, with a single touch, you could turn anything, a simple stone, a piece of fruit, a drop of water into solid, gleaming gold? It sounds like a fantasy, the kind of dream we dismiss as too good to be true. But for one legendary king, this wasn't a daydream. It was a terrifying reality. This is the story of King Midas, a tale not of triumph, but of a profound and heartbreaking paradox. It's the story of the man who was given everything he wished for, and in getting it, lost everything that truly mattered. His name has become synonymous with wealth, but his real legacy is a warning etched into the very heart of Greek mythology, a dramatic and tragic lesson about the true cost of our deepest desires. Picture that moment of realization not as a slow dawning, but as a sudden, chilling horror. Imagine the king in his palace surrounded by unimaginable riches. Every surface glitters, every object is a masterpiece of pure gold. At first, it must have been a scene of pure ecstasy, a childlike joy at a magic trick that never ended. But then, imagine the scene shifting. The king, parched with a thirst that no golden cup can quench, reaches for a bunch of grapes. As his fingers brush the plump fruit, it happens. There's no sound, just a silent, irreversible transformation. The vibrant purple skin hardens, losing its color and life, becoming a cold, metallic sculpture. The same hand that created this fortune now cannot touch a piece of bread without turning it into a substance he cannot eat. The very air seems to grow heavy with the silence of a world that can no longer sustain him. The shimmering pile of gold is no longer a treasure. It has become a prison, a terrifying trap crafted from his own wish. This is the exact moment we are going to explore together, the precise point where a dream curdled into a nightmare. This video is a journey back to ancient Greece to uncover the full story behind the myth. We will walk with King Midas from his fateful encounter with the god Dionysus, through the initial thrill of his golden touch, and right into the devastating consequences that unfolded with heartbreaking speed. We'll see how a gift meant to bring endless joy became a curse that threatened to destroy him, isolating him in a world of glittering death. This is more than just an old story. It's a timeless exploration of human ambition, a mirror held up to our own sometimes complicated relationship with wanting more. So, let's step into this gilded world and discover the tragic truth of the king who learned that all that glitters is not, in fact, gold. But before we witness that moment of horrifying clarity, we need to understand the man at the center of this drama. Who was King Midas really? He wasn't just a character in a fable, but a figure rooted in both legend and historical whispers. He ruled over Phrygia, a powerful and wealthy kingdom in what is now central Turkey. The Phrygians were known for their intricate textiles and their immense fortune, and Midas was their most famous king. In the mythological record, he is often painted as a generous and jovial ruler, a man who appreciated the finer things in life and enjoyed hosting lavish feasts. He was a patron of the arts and a lover of pleasure, but this passion for splendor also hints at a deeper flaw, a certain greed or an over-attachment to material wealth. This is the crucial setup for his entire story. His character was a mixture of good intentions and a very human weakness, making him the perfect candidate for a lesson from the gods. His path to this fateful gift began with an act of unexpected kindness. The god Dionysus, the deity of wine, ecstasy, and ritual madness, was traveling through the Phrygian countryside with a rowdy band of followers, including his beloved foster father, a wise and elderly satyr named Silenus. Silenus, having indulged a little too heavily in the festivities, wandered off and became lost, eventually collapsing in the king's famous rose gardens. Instead of punishing the intruder, King Midas recognized the old satyr and treated him with immense hospitality. For 10 days and nights, Midas entertained Silenus, feasting and conversing with him before safely returning him to Dionysus. The god was so overjoyed and grateful for the kindness shown to his dear friend that he offered Midas a reward of his choosing. Any wish, anything at all, would be granted. This was the pivotal moment, a test of the king's heart. With the entire world of possibilities before him, what would a man who already lived surrounded by luxury truly desire? His choice, as we know, was for the golden touch, a decision that reveals how his initial generosity was ultimately overshadowed by a deeper, more blinding ambition. So the stage was set for a meeting of the mundane and the divine, a chance encounter that would alter a king's destiny. To understand this pivotal event, we need to step away from the glittering palace and into the wild, untamed forests of Phrygia. This was the domain of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and the liberating power of frenzy. He was never alone, always accompanied by a raucous, joyous throng of followers, Maenads, nymphs, and satyrs, wild, half-human, half-goat creatures who embodied the spirit of unbridled celebration. Among them, one figure stood out not for his wildness but for his wisdom, Silenus. More than just a follower, Silenus was the devoted foster father and most trusted companion of Dionysus. He was often depicted as an older, portly satyr, frequently drunk and struggling to stay on his donkey, but beneath that comical exterior was a profound source of ancient knowledge and prophetic insight. It was said that if you could capture Silenus while he was in a drunken stupor and force him to speak, he would reveal secrets of the past and future. On this particular occasion, the revelry had reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with the smell of wine and crushed grapes, the sound of flutes and drums echoing through the trees. In the midst of this divine party, Silenus, having indulged even more than usual, stumbled away from the main group. He was old, unsteady, and thoroughly inebriated. He wandered aimlessly, the world a blur of green and gold, until he finally collapsed, not in some dark thicket, but in a place of cultivated beauty, the legendary rose gardens of King Midas. Imagine the scene, the old satyr snoring loudly amidst the intoxicating perfume of thousands of blooming roses, his donkey grazing peacefully nearby. This was no ordinary garden. It was a symbol of the king's wealth and his appreciation for delicate, ephemeral beauty. Now picture King Midas himself. Perhaps he was taking a morning stroll to enjoy his flowers, or maybe a guard alerted him to the strange intruder. He arrives to find this mythological creature asleep among his prized roses. This is a critical test of character. A lesser king might have seen a monster, a nuisance to be driven away or captured, but Midas was a student of the divine. He recognized Silenus immediately. He understood that this was no ordinary satyr, but the cherished companion of a powerful god. Instead of fear or anger, Midas felt a surge of opportunity, but also, initially at least, a genuine sense of honor. He saw a chance to win the favor of Dionysus, but he also understood the sacred duty of hospitality, known as xenia, which was a cornerstone of ancient Greek culture. To treat a divine guest poorly was to invite disaster. To treat them with respect was to potentially earn immense rewards. So Midas chose a path of deliberate and lavish kindness. He didn't simply let Silenus sleep it off. He ordered his servants to gently carry the old satyr into the palace. For 10 full days and nights, Midas hosted Silenus as the highest-ranking dignitary. The palace halls, already accustomed to feasts, now echoed with a different kind of celebration. They feasted on the finest foods, drank the richest wines, and Midas, a known lover of music and art, would have entertained his guest with songs and stories. Most intriguingly, they conversed. One can only imagine the discussions between the jovial, material-minded king and the ancient, wise satyr. Did Silenus, in his clearer moments, share glimpses of the world's creation or the fates of other heroes? Did he offer cryptic advice that Midas, in his excitement, failed to fully grasp? This 10-day period wasn't just a waiting game, it was a bonding experience, a genuine act of hospitality that cemented the relationship. When Silenus was fully recovered and rested, Midas didn't just point him in the right direction. He personally ensured the satyr's safe return to the god Dionysus, delivering him back to the divine retinue without a single hair on his head harmed. This act of care and respect, this upholding of the sacred guest friendship, is what prompted the gods' overwhelming gratitude. It set the trap of goodwill, making the reward that followed both a blessing and the ultimate test of the king's soul. And so, the moment of reckoning arrived. The joyful reunion of Silenus and Dionysus was a spectacle in itself. The god, who moments before might have been wrathful at the disappearance of his father figure, was instead overcome with relief and happiness upon seeing the old satyr safe, healthy, and clearly well cared for. Dionysus, a god of intense emotions, turned that immense gratitude toward the mortal king who had made it all possible. With the power of the divine at his command, he looked upon Midas and made an offer that few humans could even dream of hearing. Ask anything you wish and it shall be yours. The world, in that moment, was Midas's for the taking. He could have requested wisdom to rule his kingdom with unparalleled justice, or long life to enjoy his reign, or even a promise of divine protection for Phrygia for generations to come. But he did not. In a decision that would echo through the ages, King Midas asked for the power to turn anything he touched into gold. So, what was going through his mind? Was it simple, unadulterated greed? The answer is more complex and more human than that. We must remember the context of Midas's life. He was already a king of immense wealth. His palace was filled with treasures. His gardens were legendary. His identity was deeply intertwined with the idea of opulence. The initial wish for the golden touch likely felt like a natural extension of his existing values, not a departure from them. It was the ultimate upgrade. Think of it not as a villain's desire for power, but as a master craftsman being offered the perfect, limitless supply of his favorite material. In his mind, this gift would solve everything. It would eliminate all future financial worries for his kingdom. He could fund endless public works, build impregnable fortifications, and ensure that his people never knew want again. It was a simplistic, almost childlike solution to the complex problems of statecraft. Why bother with taxes, trade, and treaties when you can simply create wealth from thin air? This points directly to his fatal flaw, a concept the Greeks called hubris. But Midas's hubris wasn't the typical arrogance of challenging the gods. His was a hubris of imagination, a profound lack of foresight. He saw the world in terms of its material value, and he assumed that a solution built on pure material gain would have no negative consequences. He failed to consider the intricate web of life, the fact that value is not just in an object's substance, but in its function, its purpose, its very nature. A golden rose is not a rose, it is a sculpture. A golden loaf of bread is not food, it is a deadly ornament. In his excitement, Midas did not see the world as a system of interconnected needs. He saw it as a collection of separate items waiting to be upgraded into a more valuable form. His flaw was a catastrophic failure to understand the true meaning of the things he sought to improve. He desired a power that would make him the master of his world, but in doing so, he overlooked the fundamental truth that to live in the world is to depend on its fragile, perishable, and non-metallic nature. His wish was a declaration that gold was the highest good, and in making that declaration, he unknowingly sentenced himself to a life where nothing good could truly exist. Dionysus, a god known for his wild and unpredictable nature, must have paused for a moment upon hearing the king's request. Perhaps a flicker of concern crossed his face, a silent question about the wisdom of such a choice. But a god's promise is binding. Without hesitation, Dionysus granted the wish. The myth doesn't describe a grand, elaborate ritual with swirling lights and booming thunder. Often, the most powerful transformations in these stories happen with a simple, almost casual pronouncement. It's likely the god merely declared it so, his divine will instantly rewriting the very nature of Midas's reality. He might have said something like, "So be it, from this moment forward everything your flesh touches shall turn to pure, solid gold." And with those words the enchantment was woven into the king's very being. It wasn't a spell he could turn on or off with a word. It was now an intrinsic part of him, as constant and involuntary as his own heartbeat. This point is crucial for understanding the horror that follows. The power was absolute, automatic, and permanent. There was no learning curve, no safety switch. Every interaction with the physical world was now a potential act of alchemy. The rules of this new power were terrifyingly straightforward. The trigger was direct contact with his bare skin. If his finger brushed against a stone, it became a gold nugget. If his palm rested on a wooden table, the wood transformed under his touch into a sheet of priceless metal. The power seemed to work on anything and everything, blurring the sacred line between the living and the non-living. This is where the initial thrill would quickly curdle into dread. Midas, in his first moments of excitement, probably tested his gift on inanimate objects around him. A stone column in his courtyard, a clay pot, the bronze hilt of a sword, each one yielding to his touch and gleaming with that unmistakable, warm yellow hue. The joy must have been overwhelming, a childlike wonder at this impossible magic. But then his mind would have turned to the living world. What about a flower? He reaches out to his beloved rose to feel its soft petals. The moment his skin makes contact, the vibrant red deepens. The texture changes from velvety soft to unyieldingly hard. The rose is now a perfect frozen sculpture, beautiful but devoid of life, its fragrance gone forever. This was the first subtle warning, a small loss in the grand scheme of his new wealth, but a portent of everything to come. The power made no distinction. A majestic oak tree would become a golden statue if he leaned against it. The rules were simple, universal, and utterly merciless. This setup is the very engine of the tragedy. By making the power both effortless and all-encompassing, the myth removes any possibility of control or mitigation. Midas couldn't carefully choose which things to transform and which to leave alone. He couldn't wear gloves to have a moment of normalcy. As the legends suggest, even the gloves themselves would turn to gold upon his touch. His own body had become a weapon against the world he loved. Every habitual gesture, scratching his nose, wiping his brow, embracing a loved one, was now a potentially catastrophic act. The parameters were designed not for convenience but for a lesson. They created a situation where the pursuit of ultimate material value systematically destroys all other forms of value. The nutritional value of food, the comfort of a warm embrace, the simple joy of tending a living garden. The stage was now set. King Midas stood at the peak of his imagined power, holding a gift that was, in truth, a ticking clock. The first joyful experiments were over, and the relentless logic of his wish was about to descend upon every aspect of his daily life, turning his greatest triumph into his most profound regret. And so, with the divine promise still ringing in the air, King Midas was alone with his new reality. The first few moments must have been a mixture of disbelief and electrifying anticipation. He stood there, likely in his own chambers, looking at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Were they any different? They felt the same, yet he knew they now held a power that defied nature itself. He needed to test it, to confirm that the god's word was true. His eyes scanned the room, searching for an appropriate first subject. Not the grand throne or a jeweled scepter, those were already precious. He needed something simple, mundane, something whose transformation would be undeniably miraculous. Perhaps his gaze fell upon a dry twig that had fallen from a decorative arrangement, or a common river stone used as a doorstop. Something utterly worthless. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, not with fear but with pure exhilaration. He picked up the small, insignificant object. The moment his skin made contact, the change was instantaneous and silent. There was no flash of light, no sound of cracking rock. It was a seamless, almost gentle metamorphosis. The dull, grey stone in his palm seemed to blush with color, a warm, yellow glow spreading from the point of his touch until the entire object was consumed. Its weight increased, becoming heavy and solid. The rough, gritty texture smoothed into a cool, perfectly polished surface. He was no longer holding a stone. He was holding a nugget of pure, flawless gold. The breath must have caught in his throat. It was real. The power was real. This confirmation unleashed a wave of unrestrained joy, a feeling so powerful it was almost manic. This was no longer a king conducting a solemn test. This was a child who had just discovered the world's most magical toy. A laugh of pure, unadulterated delight probably echoed through the room. He dropped the golden nugget, not caring where it fell, and his eyes darted around, hungry for the next transformation. He moved through his palace not as a ruler, but as an artist possessed, his touch the ultimate brush. He laid a hand on a simple wooden stool. In an instant, the humble furniture became a magnificent golden seat, its utilitarian form now a work of immense value. He brushed his fingers against a clay water cup. The coarse pottery shimmered and shifted, becoming a gleaming goblet fit for a god. He became a whirlwind of creation, rushing from room to room in a blissful frenzy. A stone column in the courtyard became a pillar of gold. A bronze statue of a lion was transformed into a statue of far greater, solid worth. Every touch was a miracle, and every miracle fueled his ecstasy. He was not just accumulating wealth, he was participating in a divine act, reshaping his entire world into a vision of perfected, eternal value. In his mind, he was not destroying these objects but elevating them, granting them a permanence and a splendor they could never have achieved on their own. The ordinary was becoming extraordinary, the temporary was becoming forever. This was the pinnacle of his desire, the fantasy made flesh, and for those brief, glorious hours, King Midas was the happiest man who had ever lived, surrounded by a kingdom reborn in his own glorious image. He was, in every sense, the master of his universe, but this universe was now made of gold, and a universe of only one substance is a terribly fragile and ultimately lifeless place. The joy was real, but its foundation was an illusion that was about to shatter with the simple, human need for a drink of water. Exhausted but euphoric from his whirlwind of creation, King Midas finally felt the very real pangs of hunger and thirst. His body, having expended so much energy in his joyous frenzy, was now calling for sustenance, and why shouldn't it be satisfied in the most magnificent way possible? He was, after all, the richest man in the world. He called for a feast, a celebration worthy of his new divine power. His servants, likely both amazed and bewildered by the golden transformations they had witnessed, scurried to prepare the grand hall. Soon the long wooden table groaned under the weight of his kingdom's finest offerings. There were platters heaped with roasted meats, still sizzling and fragrant with herbs. There were baskets overflowing with warm, crusty bread. Bowls held ripe, dark purple grapes and figs bursting with sweetness. A golden pitcher, one he had perhaps just created himself, was filled to the brim with cool, red wine. The scene was one of pure abundance, a testament to his royal status and his newfound ability to amplify it infinitely. He took his seat at the head of the table, the polished wood of his chair having already been transformed into a throne of solid gold beneath him. He looked upon the spread with a king's pride and a hungry man's anticipation. His first target was likely the simplest, most fundamental comfort, a piece of bread. He reached out, his fingers closing around the soft, warm loaf. But the moment his skin made contact, the familiar, silent transformation occurred. The spongy texture vanished, replaced by an unyielding coldness. The appetizing golden-brown crust of the baked bread was overwritten by the harsh, metallic shine of actual gold. In his hand, he now held a heavy, sculpted lump of metal, perfectly shaped like a loaf but utterly devoid of any nourishment. A flicker of confusion, not yet fear, must have crossed his face. It was an inconvenience, a strange side effect he hadn't considered. Perhaps he even chuckled nervously, setting the golden bread aside with a muttered comment about the quirks of his new gift. No matter, he might have thought, there is plenty more. His attention shifted to the bunch of grapes, their dark skins glistening with moisture, promising a juicy, refreshing burst. He reached for the stem, his mouth already watering in anticipation. But as his fingertips brushed the closest grape, the change was instantaneous. The plump, yielding fruit hardened, its deep color freezing into a dull, brassy hue. One by one, as he tried to pluck them, the entire bunch solidified into a cold, metallic cluster. The silence in the hall would have become deafening. The cheerful clatter of servants preparing the meal would have stilled as they watched their king. Now a knot of genuine alarm tightened in Midas's stomach. He stared at his hands, then at the feast before him. He reached for a slice of roasted meat, its savory aroma filling the air. Touch, solid gold. He reached for a piece of cheese. Touch, solid gold. In a growing panic, he lunged for the pitcher of wine, desperate to quench his powerful thirst. But as his hands closed around the vessel, the pitcher itself, already gold, was safe. It was the act of drinking that doomed him. He brought the pitcher to his lips, but the moment the liquid touched his skin, the wine itself transformed. A cascade of molten gold spilled into his mouth, not refreshing him but threatening to burn and choke him. He spat it out in a fit of coughing, the metallic droplets scattering across the golden table like horrible, expensive tears. This was no longer a quirky inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the weight of all the gold he had created. The very act of eating and drinking, the most basic necessity for life, was now impossible for him. The feast, a symbol of his power and prosperity, had become a cruel exhibition of his helplessness. He was surrounded by more wealth than any human had ever possessed, and he was starving to death in the midst of it. The gold he had cherished moments before now seemed to mock him, its cold, unyielding surface a constant reminder of everything he had lost. The vibrant, living, perishable world of flavor and sustenance was now permanently out of his reach, separated from him by the very power he had begged for. This was the first true, undeniable hint of the curse, a lesson delivered not by a god but by his own empty stomach. The initial shock of seeing his feast turn to metal gave way to a cold, creeping dread that tightened around his chest. This was no longer a curious puzzle, it was a direct threat to his survival. A desperate, primal instinct took over, pushing the king to frantically test the limits of his new curse. He might have tried to snatch a grape without his fingers touching it, using a golden fork. But the moment the metal prongs, now an extension of his cursed touch, pierced the fruit's skin, the grape would have hardened instantly. He could have attempted to sip wine through a golden straw, only to feel the liquid solidify the second it made contact with his lips. Every clever workaround, every frantic idea, was met with the same silent, mocking transformation. The very intelligence he prided himself on was useless against the absolute nature of the divine power he had been granted. His desperation would have become a physical spectacle, a horrifying pantomime of starvation played out in a hall of unimaginable riches. Picture him sweating, his hands shaking as he fumbled with a golden goblet, trying to tilt it so the wine would flow directly into his mouth without touching his skin. But a single drop escaping down the side of the vessel would land on his chin and instantly solidify into a tiny, cold bead of gold. He might have tried to break off a piece of the golden bread, hoping that the inside, untouched by his skin, might still be edible. But it was gold all the way through, a solid, metallic mass. The aroma of the food, which moments before had been so inviting, now became a form of torture, a fragrant reminder of a sustenance he could no longer access. The sounds of his struggle, the clatter of golden tableware, his ragged breathing, the frustrated cry as another attempt failed, would have echoed through the silent, watching hall. His servants, who moments before had looked upon him with awe, now watched with a mixture of pity and terror. Their mighty king, the man who could create wealth from nothing, was being defeated by a piece of bread and a cup of wine. This moment marks a critical turning point in the myth, far more profound than the simple failure to eat. It's the first time Midas is forced to confront the philosophical horror of his situation. He is experiencing a radical form of isolation. He is surrounded by the stuff of life, food, drink, the very air he breathes, but he is completely severed from it. The world has become a museum exhibit behind a barrier he cannot cross, his own skin. He is a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own making, and the hunger pangs in his stomach are the first guards of this new prison. The curse attacks the most basic biological level of human need, demonstrating that no amount of abstract wealth can substitute for the fundamental requirements of a living body. A king's power, his army, his treasury, they all mean absolutely nothing when he cannot perform the simple act of taking a drink of water. The myth brilliantly uses this physical consequence to make an abstract point undeniable. Greed doesn't just corrupt the soul, it can literally starve the body. Midas's dream of infinite value has collided with the inconvenient truth that some things, like a loaf of bread, have a value that cannot be measured in gold because their value is in their function, their life-giving property. By turning food into currency, he has made it worthless to him. The fantasy isn't just cracked, it is shattering, and the king is left standing in the glittering wreckage, alone, hungry, and beginning to understand the terrible weight of the word everything in his foolish wish. The feast's golden wreckage was not just a scene of physical deprivation, it was a spiritual void. In the echoing silence of his grand hall, surrounded by the cold, beautiful artifacts of his desire, King Midas was utterly alone. The servants had retreated, their faces pale with a fear that was no longer just awe of his power, but pity for his predicament. The adrenaline of his initial joy and the frantic panic of his failed meal had both subsided, leaving behind a hollow, chilling emptiness. It was in this profound solitude that a new kind of terror began to dawn, one far worse than the pangs of hunger. He had lost his connection to the world of things, but what about the world of people? What about love? A desperate, aching need for human contact, for reassurance, likely clawed its way to the surface of his mind. And in that moment of deepest despair, the one person who could truly offer him comfort appeared. From a doorway, his young daughter, often called Zoe or Marigold in later tellings of the myth, came running into the hall. She had probably heard the commotion, the clattering of gold and the raised voices, and being innocent and full of love for her father, she rushed to him without a trace of the fear that gripped the adults. To her, he was not the king with a cursed touch, he was simply her father. Her face would have been alight with a smile, her arms outstretched, her voice calling out to him with uncomplicated affection. She was the living antithesis of everything that now surrounded him, warm, soft, impermanent, and more valuable than any treasure in his kingdom. For a split second, seeing her must have pierced the gloom in Midas's heart. Here was a reminder of the life that existed beyond gold, a beacon of genuine warmth. In his overwhelming relief and joy at the sight of her, all rational thought, all memory of the curse vanished. The warning from the feast was erased by a deeper, more primal instinct, the need to hold his child. He opened his arms to receive her, his face likely softening for the first time since the gift was granted. He did not think, he simply reacted with a father's love. The moment their bodies met, the world stopped. As she flung her arms around his neck, he would have felt the familiar, wonderful sensation of her small, warm body pressing against his, the softness of her hair against his cheek, the trusting weight of her embrace. But that sensation lasted only for a heartbeat. Then the change began. It was not instantaneous like with the inanimate objects, or perhaps it felt that way, but the horror made time distort. Under his hands, where he felt the gentle curve of her back, a creeping coldness started to spread. the vibrant, living warmth he felt began to recede, replaced by an unnatural, deepening chill. The softness of her skin and tunic hardened, becoming unyielding and smooth. He would have felt her embrace loosen, not by her own volition, but because her arms were stiffening, locking into place. The happy, murmured greeting she was surely in the middle of uttering would have been cut off, not into silence, but into a frozen, open-mouthed expression captured forever in gold. He would have pulled back in shock, his own hands now pushing against a statue that bore the perfect, terrifying likeness of his daughter. Her eyes, which moments before had sparkled with life, now stared back at him with the blank, polished sheen of metal. Her joyful expression was fixed in a lifeless rictus. The warmth was gone completely. All that remained was a cold, heavy, and perfectly detailed golden sculpture in the shape of the person he loved most in the world. The silence that followed would have been absolute, broken only by the king's own ragged gasp as the full magnitude of his action crashed down upon him. This was no ruined meal or petrified rose. This was his child. He had not just turned a thing into gold, he had destroyed a life. He had used the ultimate symbol of his greed to annihilate the ultimate symbol of true, priceless value. The embrace meant to save him had become the act that damned him completely, revealing the curse in its most vicious and heartbreaking form. The silence that fell over the hall was more than an absence of sound, it was an active, crushing force. King Midas stood frozen, his arms still partially outstretched from the embrace that had ended everything. Before him was no longer his daughter, but a perfect, chilling replica. The statue captured every detail, the folds of her dress mid-swirl, the stray strands of hair that had escaped her braid, the slight part of her lips as she had begun to speak his name. But the most devastating feature was the expression immortalized on her face, not one of fear or pain, but of pure, trusting love, a look that was now a permanent accusation. His eyes traced the cold, metallic curves, searching for some sign of life, some hint that this was a terrible dream. But the only light that reflected back was the dull, golden gleam from the thousands of other transformed objects in the room, a hall of mirrors showing him the same nightmare from every angle. This was the moment the theoretical became horrifyingly real. The spoiled feast had been a warning about survival, a problem of the body, but this was a cataclysm of the soul. The abstract concept of a curse vanished, replaced by the visceral, gut-wrenching truth. He had not simply been given a troublesome power, he had been given a weapon, and with the carelessness of a man blinded by his own desire, he had just turned it upon the one thing in his life that was truly sacred. The weight of his wish, which he had once felt as a thrill of power, now descended upon him with the physical force of a collapsing mountain. A guttural cry, half groan and half scream, was torn from his throat, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to come from a place deeper than his own being. It was the sound of a man witnessing the death of his own world by his own hand. His despair would have manifested in a frantic, hopeless dance around the statue. He might have reached out to touch the golden cheek, only to jerk his hand back, terrified that further contact would somehow make the nightmare worse. He would have pleaded with the unmoving figure, his voice cracking with desperation, begging for a sign, for forgiveness, for any shred of proof that the magic could be undone. But the only response was the echo of his own words bouncing off the cold, metallic surfaces of his palace. He was not just talking to a statue, he was talking to himself, to his own folly, in a room that had become a monument to his greed. The initial shock gave way to a tidal wave of guilt so profound it was physically debilitating. He might have collapsed to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cool, unfeeling feet of his golden child, his body racked with sobs that offered no relief. Every tear that fell was a bitter reminder of the life that was gone, a liquid testament to the humanity that his golden touch could not provide but could only destroy. In that harrowing stillness, the king was forced to conduct a brutal audit of his own desires. The memory of his meeting with Dionysus played back in his mind, but now the scene was horrifically distorted. The god's generous offer, which had seemed like a reward, was now revealed as a trap. His own eager request, which he had believed was for prosperity, was in fact a suicidal impulse. He saw with terrifying clarity that he had been given a choice between living a full, rich life surrounded by love and connection, or possessing a dead world of inert metal. And he, in his monumental short-sightedness, had chosen the dead world. He had valued the symbol over the substance, the container over the content. The palace, which hours before had been a playground for his miracles, was now a tomb. The gold that had represented eternal value now represented eternal loss. His daughter, whose laughter had once filled these halls, was now the centerpiece of a museum of despair, a beautiful, silent witness to the day her father's wish killed her. The curse was not the inability to eat or drink. Those were mere symptoms. The true curse was the irreversible knowledge that he had sacrificed everything meaningful for something utterly meaningless, and that the price of his education was a love he could never get back. The king's anguished cry echoed through the cavernous, silent hall, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that seemed to make the very gold around him shudder. In the wake of that terrible stillness, a new and more profound agony set in, the agony of understanding. He was no longer just a man who had made a mistake. He was a man standing in the ruins of his own life, forced to survey the destruction with a clarity that was itself a form of torture. His gaze was locked on the golden statue that had been his daughter, and with each passing second, the reality of what he had done etched itself deeper into his soul. This was not a nightmare from which he could awake. This was the permanent, glittering consequence of his wish. His mind, reeling from the shock, lashed out in a frantic, desperate search for an escape hatch, any possible loophole in the divine curse. He stumbled back from the statue, his eyes wide with a wild, manic hope. Perhaps if he touched her again, he thought, the magic would reverse itself. He lunged forward, pressing his hands against the cold metal of her arms, pleading, "Change back, please, change back." But his touch only made the gold gleam more brightly under the torchlight. The power was absolute and irreversible. He tried to wipe away the transformation as if it were dust on her cheek, but his frantic rubbing achieved nothing. He looked at his own hands as if they were monstrous foreign objects, the very instruments of his damnation. He might have even considered the unthinkable, amputating the cursed limbs, but the rational part of his mind knew it was futile. The power was woven into his very being, not localized in his fingertips. Every frantic attempt was a fresh lesson in hopelessness, each failure driving the spike of regret deeper into his heart. This frantic physical struggle soon gave way to a spiritual collapse. Exhausted and broken, he collapsed to the floor, his body racked with sobs that held no tears of relief, only the dry, heaving gasps of absolute despair. He was now surrounded by a fortune so vast it was beyond calculation, yet he had never known a poverty this absolute. The piles of gold coins, the golden furniture, the golden walls, they were no longer symbols of success. They were the bars of his prison, the tombstones marking the grave of his happiness. He clawed at the golden floor beneath him, not to gather wealth, but as if he could dig through it to reach the simple, forgiving earth below. He was a king who owned the world, yet he owned nothing of any real value. He had traded the warm, unpredictable, and messy reality of life for the cold, perfect, and sterile certainty of gold. And in that moment, he understood the transaction had been a catastrophic failure. The weight of his greed pressed down on him not as a metaphor, but as a physical burden, making it difficult to even breathe. From this pit of utter desolation, a single, coherent thought finally emerged: prayer. It was the last resort of a mortal who had exhausted all his own power. He lifted his face, streaked with grime and grief, toward the high ceilings of his palace, as if he could see through the stone and gold to the home of the gods themselves. His prayers were not the formal, polished petitions of a ruler. They were raw, desperate, and brutally honest. He did not beg for his wealth to be preserved or for a way to manage his curse. He confessed his folly. He cried out to Dionysus, his voice cracking, "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I see it now. This gift you gave me, it is a curse. I asked for the power to create riches, but I only created a tomb. Please, I beg of you, take it back, take it all back. I would give every ounce of this gold. I would live as the poorest beggar in the world, if only you would restore my child to me. I have learned my lesson. The cost was too high." His lamentations filled the empty hall, a monotonous, heartbreaking litany of regret. He prayed until his voice was hoarse, until his body was spent from the effort. He was no longer a powerful monarch issuing commands. He was a shattered man admitting his own profound weakness, finally understanding that some forces are beyond mortal control and that some desires, when granted, become instruments of self-destruction. In the deepest poverty of his spirit, King Midas had finally arrived at a wisdom that all his previous wealth and power could never buy. Hours turned into an eternity within the golden tomb of his palace. King Midas remained on the cold floor, his body curled in a ball of grief, his eyes fixed on the unmoving statue of his daughter. The initial storm of weeping had passed, leaving behind a hollow, aching silence. But within that silence, a new resolve began to flicker, a desperate, last-ditch hope born from the absolute certainty of his own failure. He could not undo what he had done with his own hands. The only power greater than this curse was the one who had bestowed it. He had to find Dionysus. Pushing himself up on trembling legs, the king looked like a ghost of his former self. His fine robes were soiled and disheveled, his face was pale and streaked with tears, but in his eyes was a single, burning purpose. He would plead his case to the god himself. His journey out of the palace was a stark contrast to his triumphant tour just hours before. Where he had once strode with the confidence of a creator, he now moved with the caution of a man navigating a field of landmines. Every doorway, every piece of furniture was a threat. He held his arms tight against his body, his hands clenched into fists, terrified of making accidental contact and adding to the golden nightmare. He found a long, heavy cloak made of a thick, coarse wool, and with immense care used a piece of cloth to handle it without transforming it, draping it over his shoulders and pulling the hood low over his face. It was a feeble protection, but it was all he had. Stepping outside, the ordinary world assaulted his senses. The warmth of the sun, a sensation he had taken for granted, felt like a miracle. The chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind were sounds from a life he had irrevocably left behind. He did not look back at his glittering palace. He set off toward the wild, wooded slopes where he had first encountered the god's retinue, driven by a prayer that had become his entire existence. The search was not easy. A god does not appear on command. For what felt like days, Midas wandered through the forests, his voice growing hoarse as he called out the name of Dionysus. He was no longer a king, he was a supplicant, a beggar in the wilderness. He slept on the bare ground, his hunger and thirst a constant, gnawing reminder of why he was there. He avoided all living things, shying away from a strayed deer or a low-hanging branch, his curse making him a pariah even in nature. He was a man completely alone, stripped of every privilege, with nothing to offer but his regret. Finally, when his strength was nearly gone, he found them, or rather, they allowed him to be found. The air grew thick with the smell of wine and earth, and the distant sound of flutes and laughter guided him to a clearing. There, the divine party was in full swing, exactly as it had been before. Maenads danced in ecstatic circles, satyrs played their pipes, and at the center of it all, reclining on a bed of moss and flowers, was Dionysus with a contented Silenus by his side. The scene of joyous abandon was a brutal contrast to Midas's own despair. He stumbled into the clearing, falling to his knees at the edge of the revelry. The music faltered, the dancing slowed. All eyes turned to the ragged, broken figure who had intruded upon their paradise. Dionysus looked at him, his expression not one of anger, but of a calm, almost sorrowful recognition. It was as if he had been expecting this visit. Midas crawled forward, not daring to stand, and prostrated himself before the god. He did not begin with a demand or a justification. He began with a confession. His voice, when it came, was a raw whisper carrying the weight of his entire shattered world. "Lord Dionysus," he cried out, his forehead pressed to the dirt. "I come to you not as a king, but as a fool. The gift you gave me in your generosity has become my prison. I was blind, I saw only the glitter of gold, and I was deaf to the true music of life. I thought I was asking for a blessing, but I was truly asking for my own destruction." He lifted his head, his face a mask of utter remorse. "I have learned the lesson you intended for me, though the cost has been more terrible than I could ever have imagined. My touch, which I believed would bring me everything, has taken from me the only thing that mattered, my daughter, my own child." His voice broke, and he could not continue for a moment, overcome by the memory. "I beg of you, not for my sake, but for hers, take back this cursed power. I will gladly give up every piece of gold. I will live in the poorest hovel. I will renounce my throne forever. I would trade all the riches in the world just to see her breathe again. Please, I implore you, show me the path to undo this horror. I admit my foolishness. I understand the price of greed. Have mercy." This plea was the complete antithesis of his original wish. Where he had once asked for a power to acquire, he now begged for a power to relinquish. Where he had valued material wealth, he now recognized its profound emptiness. His transformation was evident in every word. He was no longer the greedy king who saw the world as something to be possessed. He was a repentant father who understood that love could not be measured, owned, or turned into metal. His wealth, his palace, his very kingdom, he offered it all as a sacrifice for a single chance at redemption. He waited, trembling, for the god's judgment, his entire future hanging on the response of the deity who embodied both boundless joy and fearsome consequence. Dionysus listened to the king's desperate plea, not with the wrath of an offended deity, but with the solemn understanding of a teacher who had always known this day would come. He saw the genuine, soul-crushing remorse in Midas's eyes, the utter transformation from a proud monarch to a broken man. The god's expression softened. His purpose was not to punish eternally, but to teach a lesson that would be remembered for ages. Leaning forward, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of divine authority, Dionysus offered a path to salvation. He told Midas that there was a way to cleanse himself of the golden touch, but it would require a journey of humility and purification. The king must travel to the distant land of Lydia, to the source of a great river known as the Pactolus. There, at the sacred spring where the water bubbled up from the earth itself, he was to submerge his entire body, washing away the cursed power and returning it to the earth from which all gold originally came. This was not a simple errand, it was a profound act of penance. The journey itself was designed to be part of the cure, a physical manifestation of his spiritual cleansing. Midas had to leave behind the glittering prison of his palace, the very symbol of his avarice, and venture into the world as a humble traveler. He could not take a golden chariot or an entourage of servants. He set out on foot, wearing only the simple cloak that protected him from his own touch, carrying nothing but a waterskin and the crushing weight of his regret. Each step away from his kingdom was a step toward redemption, a deliberate rejection of the life he had so foolishly prized. The road was long and arduous, taking him through rugged mountains and vast plains. He walked for days, exposed to the elements, his body growing lean from hunger and his spirit tempered by the hardship. He was no longer a king surrounded by wealth. He was a pilgrim, stripped of every privilege, whose only possession was the hope of forgiveness. The landscape itself seemed to reflect his inner journey. He moved from the manicured, artificial beauty of his gilded palace to the raw, untamed beauty of the natural world. He saw forests that were alive with sound and color, rivers that flowed with life-giving water, and mountains that stood with an ancient, unshakable dignity. This living, breathing world was a constant, silent rebuke to the dead, metallic kingdom he had created. Every rustling leaf and babbling brook whispered the same truth. Real value lies in growth, change, and life itself, not in cold, unchanging metal. The journey forced him to witness the very things his curse had destroyed, deepening his understanding with every passing mile. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the lush green valley of Lydia and found the river Pactolus. The river was not a mighty, roaring torrent, but a clear, sparkling stream that wound its way through a pebbled bed. Following it upstream, he came to its source, a peaceful spring where pure, cold water welled up from a cleft in the rocks, bubbling into a small, clear pool before beginning its journey to the sea. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of wet stone and mint. This was the place. With trembling hands and a heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope, Midas carefully removed his protective cloak. He stood naked and vulnerable at the water's edge, staring at his own hands, the instruments of so much destruction. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the shockingly cold water and waded toward the center of the pool. Then, with a final prayer on his lips, he plunged his entire body beneath the surface. The effect was immediate and miraculous. There was no explosion of light or sound, but a gentle, immense release. He felt a strange sensation, as if a tight, invisible shell that had been encasing him was dissolving, washing away in the current. He could feel the divine energy leaving his body, flowing out from his fingertips and being carried off by the sacred waters. When he emerged, gasping from the cold, the first thing he did was look at his hands. They were just hands again. Cautiously, fearfully, he reached out and touched a simple leaf floating on the water's surface. It remained a leaf, soft and green. He scooped up a handful of water and watched it trickle through his fingers, liquid and life-giving. A sob of relief, the first pure emotion he had felt since the curse began, escaped him. He was free, the terrible power was gone. But as he stood there, shivering in the stream, he noticed something extraordinary happening around him. The riverbed, which moments before had been made of ordinary sand and stones, began to glitter. The divine power he had washed away did not vanish. It transmuted, seeping into the very sands of the Pactolus. Where once there were plain pebbles, there were now countless specks of gold, sparkling in the sunlight like a river of stars. King Midas had been cleansed of his curse, but the river itself would forever after be famous as a source of immense wealth, a permanent, flowing reminder of a king's folly and a god's mercy. And so, with his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, King Midas stood at the edge of the Pactolus River. The journey had stripped him of his royal bearing, leaving a gaunt, desperate man shivering in the cool air. Before him, the water flowed with a gentle, persistent murmur, a sound of life and movement that was the absolute opposite of the dead silence of his golden palace. This was the moment of truth, the end of his pilgrimage. Taking a final, shuddering breath, he shed his protective cloak and stepped into the current. The water was shockingly cold, a biting clarity that sharpened every sense. He waded deeper, the pebbles smooth beneath his bare feet, until he stood chest deep in the stream. With a prayer to Dionysus on his lips, a prayer not for wealth but for forgiveness and the simple return of his humanity, he closed his eyes and plunged completely beneath the surface. The transformation was not violent or loud, but a profound, almost gentle release. As the sacred waters enveloped him, Midas felt a strange sensation, as if a heavy, invisible cloak he had been wearing for an eternity was suddenly dissolving. A warmth not of fire but of pure energy seemed to flow out from the very core of his being, radiating from his chest, down his arms, and out through his fingertips. He could almost envision it, a shimmering, golden haze leaving his body and merging with the river. It was the curse itself, the divine power that had become a prison, being drawn out and carried away by the cleansing current. The tension that had gripped his muscles since the moment he received the gift finally eased. When he could hold his breath no longer, he burst up through the surface, gasping and blinking water from his eyes. His first act was one of terrified hope. He looked at his hands, turning them over in the sunlight. They were just hands, pale, wrinkled from the water, but human. With a trembling finger, he reached out and touched a floating leaf. It bobbed on the water, remaining supple and green. He cupped his hands and brought the cold, clear water to his lips, drinking deeply for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The relief that washed over him was more powerful than any joy he had felt upon creating his first nugget of gold. He was free, but as he stood there, weeping with gratitude, he noticed a change in the river itself. The sandy bed beneath his feet, which had been a plain mixture of gray and brown stones, now sparkled with 1,000 points of light. The divine energy he had washed away had to go somewhere. It could not simply vanish. As it left his body, it transmuted, seeping into the very minerals of the riverbed. Ordinary pebbles were now flecked with brilliant, unmistakable gold. The current flowing over his feet carried the glittering dust downstream, painting the riverbed with a shimmering, metallic sheen. In that single, miraculous moment, King Midas was purified, and the river Pactolus was forever transformed. This event, according to the myth, is the origin of the legendary gold-rich sands that made the Lydian kingdom, centuries later, one of the wealthiest in the ancient world. The river became a literal source of fortune, a permanent, flowing reminder of a king's tragic folly and a god's ultimate mercy. The gold was still there, but it was now part of the natural world, something to be worked for and gathered, not conjured with a catastrophic touch. The curse had been lifted from the man and returned to the earth where it belonged. The journey back to Phrygia was a pilgrimage of a different kind, a walk through a world newly vibrant and forgiving. Every sensation was a miracle to the cured king. He could feel the rough texture of the bark as he steadied himself against a tree, the gentle give of the earth beneath his feet, the refreshing coolness of water from a stream he cupped in his hands and drank without fear. The world was no longer a collection of objects to be valued, but a living, breathing entity to be experienced. Yet beneath this profound gratitude lay a deep, thrumming anxiety. The memory of the golden statue of his daughter was a ghost that walked beside him with every step. Had the purification worked fully, would the curse linger on the one thing it had touched that mattered most? Dionysus had promised restoration, but the king's heart, so freshly scarred by his own folly, dared not believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. When his palace finally came into view, it was a jarring sight. The sun gleamed off its surfaces with a blinding intensity, the walls and towers still solid gold from his initial joyous rampage. It stood as a monstrous monument to his mistake, a beautiful shell containing his deepest sorrow. He approached the main gates with the caution of a thief, his heart pounding not with pride but with a terrifying dread. Pushing the heavy, golden doors open, he stepped back into the silent hall. The scene was exactly as he had left it, the golden feast still laid out on the table, the golden stools, and in the center of it all, the figure that had haunted his every waking moment. There she was, frozen in that eternal, loving gesture, a perfect, heartbreaking sculpture. The sight stole the breath from his lungs anew. For a long moment he could only stand and stare, his courage faltering. What if his touch, now cleansed, had no effect? What if he was condemned to live with this golden memorial forever? Summoning every ounce of his will, he forced his feet to move, each step echoing in the profound silence. He approached the statue slowly, his hand trembling violently as he raised it. This was the ultimate test, a reversal of the act that had shattered his world. He paused, his fingertips just inches from the cold, metallic surface of her arm. He closed his eyes, sent a final, silent prayer to Dionysus, and with the gentlest of movements he laid his bare skin upon the gold. The transformation was not instantaneous like the curse, but a gradual, wondrous thaw. It began at the point of contact, a soft, warm light spreading out from his touch like a wave of life pushing back the metallic stillness. The harsh, yellow gleam of the gold receded, flowing away like water and revealing the soft, warm hues of living skin beneath. The unyielding hardness softened into the pliable flesh of a child's arm. The wave of life swept up her body, down her legs, through her hair. The frozen expression on her face seemed to melt, the features relaxing from their metallic rigidity back into the soft, animated face of his daughter. The statue took a breath. It was a small, almost imperceptible intake of air, but to Midas, it was the loudest and most beautiful sound in the universe. Her eyes, which had been blank pools of metal, blinked slowly, then focused on him. The spell of the curse was broken. She was whole, alive, and completely unaware of the horror that had transpired. To her, no time had passed at all. The last thing she remembered was running to embrace her father. She looked at him, standing there with tears streaming openly down his face, his hand still resting gently on her arm. "Father," she said, her voice laced with innocent confusion. "Why are you crying?" The sound of her voice, so real and so familiar, broke the last dam holding back Midas's emotions. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around her in a crushing, desperate embrace, burying his face in her shoulder. This time, he felt the wonderful, living warmth of her body, the softness of her tunic, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. He held her as if she might vanish at any moment, his entire body shaking with sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. These were not the tears of grief he had shed before, but the cleansing tears of a second chance, a gratitude so profound it could only be expressed through weeping. He held her and wept for the loss he had endured and for the miracle of her return. His daughter, bewildered but feeling her father's overwhelming emotion, hugged him back just as tightly. She patted his back soothingly, a small gesture of comfort that meant more to him than any kingdom. After a long while, when his tears had subsided to quiet sniffles, he pulled back, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears of his that had fallen on her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, seeing not a trace of the golden prison she had been in. "They are tears of joy, my love," he finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with emotion. "The greatest joy a father can ever know." In that moment, holding his restored daughter in a hall of gold that no longer had any power over him, King Midas understood the true meaning of wealth. It had nothing to do with metal and everything to do with the fragile, temporary, and infinitely precious gift of a loved one's embrace. The hall that had once echoed with his manic laughter was now a place of quiet reflection. King Midas was a king again, but the throne he now occupied felt different beneath him, not because it was no longer gold, for much of the palace remained tragically, permanently transformed, but because he himself was fundamentally altered. The man who had returned from the river Pactolus was not the same man who had wished for the golden touch. That king had been defined by his possessions. This king was defined by his loss and his hard-won redemption. His brush with absolute power had not made him proud. It had scoured him clean of pride, leaving behind a profound and lasting humility. He no longer saw his kingship as a right to command and acquire, but as a responsibility to serve and protect the fragile, living world he had so carelessly endangered. This newfound perspective manifested in his daily life as a quiet revolution. The glittering gold that filled his palace no longer held any allure for him. In fact, it served as a constant, sobering reminder of his folly. Where he once took pleasure in displaying his wealth, he now seemed to look past it, his eyes seeking out the few things that had escaped his cursed touch. A simple wooden bowl, a humble clay jug, a woolen rug. These ordinary objects were now treasures beyond price because they functioned as they were meant to. He could hold the bowl and feel its honest weight. He could drink from the jug and taste the water it carried. These were not just things, they were testaments to a world that worked, a world of use and purpose that his greed had almost destroyed. The immense fortune frozen within his walls became a kind of penitential architecture, a beautiful prison he had escaped, whose bars he was careful never to touch again. His greatest joy was found in the most basic human experiences, each one a miracle he would never again take for granted. The act of eating a meal became a sacred ritual. He would savor the coarse texture of bread, the juiciness of a piece of fruit, the simple flavor of fresh water, each bite and sip a celebration of life itself. He would often walk through his kingdom, not in a royal procession but alone, to simply observe. He would stand by a stream and watch the water flow, marveling at its movement, its sound, its refusal to be anything but what it was. He would run his hands through the soil, feeling its richness, understanding now that true wealth was not mined from the earth but grown from it. The vibrant green of a leaf, the song of a bird, the warmth of the sun on his face, these were the real currencies of a happy life, and he had amassed a fortune in gratitude for them. But the most significant change was in his relationships, especially with his daughter. The memory of her golden form was a scar on his soul, but it also made every moment with her unbearably precious. He was no longer a distant monarch, too busy with affairs of state. He became a present and deeply attentive father. He would spend hours listening to her stories, playing simple games and holding her hand, each touch a reaffirmation of the life he had been given back. His love for her was no longer an abstract fact of his kingship. It was the active, breathing center of his existence. This warmth extended to his subjects. He became a more compassionate ruler, one who understood that the wealth of a nation was not in its treasury, but in the health and happiness of its people. He likely enacted laws that protected the poor and invested in agriculture, ensuring that no one in his kingdom would ever take a loaf of bread for granted. The man who had almost starved to death surrounded by gold now made the well-being of his people's stomachs a primary concern of his reign. In the end, King Midas's story is not ultimately about a curse, but about a cure. The golden touch was the illness, and the loss of everything he loved was the terrible, necessary medicine. He was, in a way, fortunate. The gods had given him a lesson so extreme and so immediate that he could not possibly ignore it. He was granted the rarest of second chances to see the world with new eyes after having been blind. His legacy, therefore, is not one of foolish greed but of enlightened wisdom. He serves as an eternal reminder that our desires often come with hidden costs, and that the relentless pursuit of more can blind us to the incredible value of what we already have. The myth asks us a simple, haunting question, one that Midas himself learned the hard way. What are you willing to touch, and what are you willing to lose in your own pursuit of a golden life? Yet the story of King Midas does not conclude with his quiet, grateful life in Phrygia. The myth continues with a second, equally revealing chapter, a tale that shows how the scars of a profound lesson do not always erase our deepest flaws. For Midas, the trauma of the golden touch had cured him of his greed for material wealth, but it had not necessarily gifted him with wisdom or good judgment. A different kind of weakness remained, one that would lead him into a second, equally disastrous confrontation with the divine. This time, the stage was not his palace filled with gold, but a sun-drenched hillside, and the conflict was not about the value of objects, but the very definition of beauty itself. The god involved was no longer the mercurial Dionysus, but the radiant, perfectionist Apollo, the god of the sun, of prophecy, and above all, of music. The contest was born from the boastful pride of Pan, the rustic god of the wild, shepherds and flocks. Pan was a creature of earth and instinct, a half-man, half-goat who spent his days cavorting in the forests and mountains. His instrument was the syrinx or panpipes, a simple set of reeds bound together, whose melodies were meant to mimic the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees or the bubbling sound of a mountain stream. Pan's music was charming, pastoral, and deeply pleasing to those who loved the untamed world, but it was this very affection for his own art that led Pan to make a fatal error. Flushed with confidence, he began to boast that his musical skill was superior even to that of the great Apollo, the master of the golden lyre. This was an outrageous claim, a challenge that could not be ignored. Apollo, whose music was said to bring perfect order to the cosmos, to heal the sick, and to express the very harmony of the spheres, would not allow such an insult to stand. He accepted the challenge, and a contest was arranged on the slopes of Mount Tmolus, a mountain known for its wisdom, who would serve as the judge. The scene must have been a study in contrast. On one side stood Apollo, resplendent and majestic, his golden lyre gleaming in the sunlight. He was the embodiment of civilization, reason, and celestial order. Opposing him was Pan, hairy and unkempt, clutching his simple pipes, a representative of the raw, untamed, and chaotic forces of nature. The audience was a mix of nymphs, satyrs, and various mountain deities, all gathered to witness this clash of cosmic principles. And among them, somehow, was King Midas. Perhaps he was there as a respected monarch, or maybe his own love for the rustic and simple pleasures of life, a preference that had only deepened after his ordeal, had drawn him to the event. He was about to become a pivotal player in a drama far beyond his understanding. The contest began. Pan played first. The sound that came from his syrinx was lovely and seductive. It was the music of the countryside, of lazy afternoons and hidden forest glades. It spoke to the heart, evoking a sense of peaceful contentment and primal joy. It was a melody that made one think of cool shade on a hot day and the simple happiness of a shepherd with his flock. To Midas, whose soul now craved the uncomplicated beauty of the natural world after the sterile horror of his golden palace, Pan's music was deeply moving. It felt authentic, earthy, and profoundly relatable. Then it was Apollo's turn. The god of music struck the strings of his lyre, and a sound of an entirely different order filled the air. This was not the music of the earth, but the music of the heavens. It was complex, mathematically perfect, and breathtakingly beautiful. It did not just please the ear, it seemed to reorganize the very soul, bringing a sense of cosmic harmony and intellectual elevation. The notes were so pure and powerful that they commanded reverence, not just enjoyment. The mountain itself, old Tmolus, swayed with pleasure at the sound. When the final note faded, the verdict was swift and unanimous. Tmolus declared Apollo the undisputed winner. The music of the lyre, with its sublime order and divine complexity, was simply in a different realm altogether from the pleasant but simple melodies of the panpipes. But then, a single dissenting voice broke the respectful silence. King Midas, unable to contain himself, shouted out that the judgment was unfair. He passionately argued that Pan's music was better. In his view, the rustic, straightforward tunes of the panpipes were more enjoyable, more real than the sophisticated, intricate composition of Apollo. This was Midas's second great folly. Just as he had failed to see the complex consequences of the golden touch, he now failed to appreciate the qualitative difference between simple charm and true, transcendent art. He confused his personal preference for the simple life with an objective standard of quality. In defending Pan, he was not really defending the god. He was defending his own limited taste, his own inability to perceive the layers of beauty and order in Apollo's performance. It was an act of profound arrogance, a mortal once again believing his own narrow perception was superior to divine judgment. The reaction from Apollo was immediate and fierce. The radiant god turned his piercing gaze upon the foolish king, his anger burning as brightly as the sun he commanded. He rebuked Midas not just for his poor taste, but for the arrogance of his ears. It seems, Apollo declared, his voice ringing with divine authority, that your ears are as dull as your judgment is flawed. They are unfit to appreciate the finer things, so they shall be transformed to match the coarseness of your understanding. And with a wave of his hand, Apollo worked his punishment. Midas felt a strange, tugging sensation on the sides of his head. He reached up in horror to find that his ears were no longer human. They had elongated, growing coarse gray hair and twisting upward into the large, twitching, unmistakable ears of a donkey. This was a punishment far more humiliating than the golden touch. Gold could be hidden away in a palace, but the donkey ears were a permanent, visible brand of his foolishness. Midas, utterly mortified, fled the scene. He wrapped a large, bulky turban around his head to conceal his shame, hoping to keep his embarrassing secret from the world. He returned to his court, a king once again marked by a divine curse, a living lesson in the danger of mistaking personal preference for universal truth. And this time, the curse was not just a personal torment, it was a public disgrace, a secret that would inevitably be discovered, adding a new layer of tragedy to the story of the king who never seemed to learn his lesson. And so, the king who had been cleansed of one curse now found himself branded by another, a humiliation that clung to him as visibly as the golden touch once had. Fleeing the slopes of Mount Tmolus, Midas's heart pounded not with the existential dread of starvation, but with the hot, sharp sting of shame. The divine judgment of Apollo was not a lesson in the value of life, but a brutal critique of the king's very perception. Where the golden touch was a private horror that became public, the donkey ears were an immediate, grotesque public spectacle. His first instinct was to hide. He frantically wrapped his head in a large purple turban, the garment of a king now serving as a desperate mask for a fool. The journey back to his palace was a torment of self-consciousness. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like mocking laughter, and every glance from a passing traveler felt like an accusation. He returned to his golden court not as a redeemed man, but as a prisoner of his own flawed judgment, condemned to wear a permanent, twitching reminder of his inability to see, or rather to hear the truth. This second punishment was brilliantly tailored to the crime. Apollo, the god of light and truth, did not strike Midas blind for his failure to see beauty, but instead altered his hearing, the very sense he had so arrogantly misused. The long, hairy ears of a donkey were a symbol of stubbornness and stupidity in the ancient world. They were a physical manifestation of the coarseness Apollo had accused him of possessing. The curse was a form of divine irony. If Midas's ears were so dull that they preferred the simple pipes of Pan to the cosmic harmony of the lyre, then they would be transformed to match their inner nature. They were a mark not of evil, but of a profound lack of refinement, a permanent advertisement of his poor taste. Unlike the golden touch, which isolated him from the physical world, the donkey ears isolated him from society. He could no longer appear in public as a dignified monarch. His authority was instantly undermined by the ridiculous, animalistic appendages sprouting from his head. The curse attacked his identity at its core, challenging his very right to rule, for what kind of king could be so foolish? The daily life of Midas now became a meticulous exercise in secrecy. The turban became a permanent fixture, a heavy, sweltering burden he was forced to wear from the moment he awoke until he retired to his private chambers. Courtiers would have noticed the change, the king's newfound reluctance to remove his headgear even during the warmest days or most formal feasts. Whispers would have circulated through the palace halls. He could no longer enjoy the simple pleasure of feeling the breeze on his face or washing without a frantic fear of being seen. Every interaction was fraught with anxiety. A sudden gust of wind, a servant accidentally bumping into him, a child's playful tug at his robe, any of these could expose his shameful secret. The curse created a paranoia that was perhaps more psychologically draining than the despair of the golden touch. That was a tragedy, this was a farce, and being the butt of a divine joke is its own unique kind of agony. Yet a secret of this magnitude, one that requires constant vigilance, cannot be kept by a king alone. There was one person who had to know, his royal barber. The man tasked with maintaining the king's appearance would inevitably discover the truth. Midas was forced to summon his most trusted barber, swearing him to an oath of absolute secrecy on pain of death. One can imagine the scene in the king's private chambers. the barber's hands trembling as he unwound the turban, his gasp of shock quickly stifled as he beheld the long grey ears. From that day forward, the royal haircuts became a ritual of shared dread. The barber, living under the threat of execution, carried the burden of the king's secret, a heavy weight that grew heavier with each passing day. He was now an accomplice to the monarch's humiliation, forced to go about his daily life pretending that the most powerful man in the kingdom did not have the ears of a farm animal. This dynamic introduces a fascinating element to the myth, the psychological toll of a secret on the one who must keep it, a man of no status who holds the reputation of a king in his hands. The curse's impact rippled outward, enslaving another soul to the king's foolishness. For a time, the heavy purple turban served as a sufficient shield, a regal disguise that allowed King Midas to maintain a fragile semblance of his former dignity. He presided over his court, issued decrees, and walked through his palace, all while the secret twitched and itched beneath the elaborate layers of cloth. But hair, unlike shame, continues to grow. This simple biological fact soon created an unbearable predicament for the king. His royal barber, a man entrusted with the intimate duty of maintaining the monarch's appearance, would have to be let in on the humiliating truth. The barber was summoned to the king's most private chambers, the doors firmly shut against any prying eyes or ears. One can only imagine the barber's confusion as he entered to find the king still wearing his turban, his face a mask of grim anxiety. Midas would have paced before him, explaining the impossible situation in a low, urgent voice. He likely swore the man to a sacred oath of secrecy, threatening him with exile or even death if he ever breathed a word of what he was about to see. With trembling hands and a heart full of dread, the king would have slowly, reluctantly unwound the turban. The barber's reaction must have been a study in suppressed shock, a sharp intake of breath, eyes wide with disbelief, followed by a forced professional composure as he beheld the long, hairy, unmistakably donkey ears sprouting from the sides of his sovereign's head. From that day forward, the royal haircut became a bizarre and tense ritual. In the seclusion of the king's chamber, the barber would perform his duty with meticulous care, trimming the king's human hair while carefully tending to the animalistic ears that demanded their own maintenance. These sessions were conducted in near total silence, broken only by the snip of shears and the king's nervous commands. The barber, a simple craftsman, now carried a burden heavier than any he had ever known. He held the reputation of the king in his hands, a secret so absurd and damning that it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He returned to his home each day, to his wife and his children, to the chatter of his neighbors, and had to pretend that everything was normal. He would listen to the gossip in the marketplace, hear the whispers about the king's strange new fashion, and feel the secret burning like a hot coal in his mind. The urge to share it, to relieve the immense psychological pressure, must have been overwhelming, but the fear of the king's wrath kept his lips sealed. He became a prisoner of the truth, his own life held hostage by the king's folly. The barber's torment grew with each passing week. The secret, which initially felt like a dangerous privilege, soon festered into a source of genuine anguish. He found he could no longer look people in the eye, fearing his own face would betray him. He became withdrawn and irritable, his sleep plagued by nightmares of the king's twitching ears. The human psyche is not built to contain a truth of such magnitude alone. It needs to share, to confess, to dilute the burden through conversation. But the barber had no such outlet. He was trapped in a silent scream, the bizarre image of the monarch's ears seared into his memory, a truth that was simultaneously ridiculous and deadly serious. He began to see the secret in everything. The long leaves of a willow tree seemed to mock him. The floppy ears of a dog in the street felt like a personal taunt. The world had become a gallery of constant, cruel reminders of the thing he could not say. The knowledge was eating him alive from the inside, a psychic poison with no antidote except for a confession he dared not make. But the burden of the king's bizarre secret was a weight too heavy for any one man to carry forever. the royal barber, once a simple and contented man, found himself trapped in a prison of silence. Every day he lived in fear, his own tongue becoming a potential enemy. He could not share the truth with his wife over dinner, nor confess his anxiety to a priest. The image of those long, twitching ears was seared into his mind, and the pressure to speak the words aloud grew into a kind of madness. He felt the secret festering inside him, a poisonous truth that threatened to burst out at any moment in a careless laugh or an unguarded sigh. He knew that if he uttered the words to another person, the king would surely have him executed. Yet, if he did not find some release, the secret itself would kill him, slowly eroding his sanity. Driven to desperation by this impossible dilemma, the barber devised a plan that seemed, in his tortured mind, to be a perfect solution. He would not tell the secret to a person, but to the earth itself. The earth was vast and silent. It could hold a confession without judgment, and he believed without repetition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he slipped out of the city and walked to a remote, marshy area by the banks of a river. The air was thick with the sound of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs. He found a patch of soft, damp earth far from any path or prying eyes. Falling to his knees, he began to dig. The physical act of scraping away the soil was a relief, a channel for his frantic energy. When the hole was deep enough, he leaned close, his lips almost touching the cool, dark soil. He took a final, shuddering breath, and then he whispered the words he had held inside for so long, the phrase that contained all his fear and shame. "King Midas has donkey ears." The moment the words left his lips, a profound sense of relief washed over him. It was done. The truth was out, but it was buried, safely entombed in the ground. He quickly shoved the dirt back into the hole, patting it down firmly until the ground looked as undisturbed as when he had found it. He stood up, brushed the soil from his knees, and walked home feeling lighter than he had in months. He had confessed his terrible knowledge, and the world had not ended. He believed he had finally found peace, but the natural world operates on its own rules, indifferent to the clever schemes of humans. In the moist, fertile earth where the barber had whispered his secret, a cluster of reeds began to grow. They sprouted quickly, nourished by the water from the nearby river, their tall, slender stalks reaching for the sky. They were ordinary reeds, the kind used for thatching roofs or weaving baskets. Yet they were not ordinary at all. They had been seeded with a king's humiliation. They had absorbed the barber's whispered words, and the secret became part of their very fiber. Weeks or perhaps months later, when the reeds were fully grown, a gentle wind swept through the marsh. It played through the hollow stalks of the reeds, and as the wind passed, it drew forth a sound, but it was not the usual rustling whisper of the reeds. As the air moved through them, the reeds seemed to form distinct, sighing words. At first, it was just a murmur, an almost musical sigh, but to a shepherd tending his flock nearby, or a traveler stopping to drink from the river, the sound became unmistakable. The reeds were not just rustling, they were speaking, and the phrase they repeated over and over with every gust of wind was a simple, devastating sentence for all the world to hear. King Midas has donkey ears. The secret was no longer a secret. It traveled on the breeze from the marshland to the fields, from the fields to the outskirts of the city, and finally into the very heart of the marketplace. At first, people dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a strange auditory illusion. But as more and more people heard the whispering reeds, the truth could no longer be denied. The story spread like wildfire, from whispered conversations in taverns to open laughter in the streets. The king's most guarded shame, the humiliating mark of his second divine punishment, was now the talk of the entire kingdom. The barber's clever plan to bury the truth had in fact planted it, allowing it to grow and multiply until it was carried on the very air everyone breathed. Midas's attempt to conceal his folly had ultimately led to its most public and enduring exposure, proving once again that a truth, especially one bestowed by the gods, can never truly be hidden. And so, the final, whispering judgment of the reeds brings the story of King Midas to its poignant conclusion, leaving us not just with a memorable character, but with a powerful set of ideas that have resonated for millennia. At its heart, the myth is a masterfully crafted exploration of greed, but not in the simplistic way we often imagine. It's not merely a warning that wanting money is bad. It's a far more sophisticated and devastating critique of a particular kind of desire. The desire for a simplistic, instant solution to the complex problems of life. Midas's wish represents a fundamental human temptation, the belief that if we could just acquire enough of one universally valued thing, all other complications would simply melt away. He saw gold as the ultimate answer, a key that could unlock every door. The tragedy of the myth is that he was right. The golden touch did unlock every door, but in doing so, it permanently locked him out of the very rooms he wished to enter. It's a lesson in unintended consequences, showing how a single-minded focus on accumulation can blind us to the intricate ecosystem of value that makes life worth living. The story brilliantly dissects greed by attacking its core assumption that more is always better. Midas didn't just want a lot of gold, he wanted an infinite supply, a power that would make the very concept of scarcity obsolete. This is the fantasy of absolute wealth, the dream of never having to worry about resources again. But the myth forces us to ask a critical question: what is wealth actually for? Is it an end in itself, or is it a means to an end? For Midas, gold became the end. He was so enchanted by the process of creation, by the act of turning the mundane into the precious, that he forgot the purpose of the objects he was transforming. A chair's value isn't in the material it's made from, but in its function, to provide a place to rest. Food's value is in its ability to nourish. A daughter's value is in the love and life she embodies. By making everything gold, Midas systematically stripped the world of its functional value, leaving behind a landscape of breathtakingly beautiful uselessness. His greed wasn't just for a thing, but for a state of being where he was the master of value. In achieving this, he discovered that he had instead become a slave to a single, tyrannical form of value that rendered all others null and void. This leads us to the myth's most heartbreaking contribution to the theme, the concept of pricelessness. The story draws a sharp distinction between price and worth. Everything in Midas's world had a price that he could infinitely inflate, but in the process he lost sight of what was truly priceless. These are the things that cannot be bought, sold, or manufactured: the taste of food, the comfort of an embrace, the sound of a loved one's voice. These elements of human experience exist outside the economy of material exchange. They are valuable precisely because they are ephemeral, because they require care and attention to sustain. The moment Midas gained the power to turn anything into gold, he lost the ability to participate in this other, more vital economy. The myth argues that our most profound satisfactions come not from what we own, but from our interactions with the world, interactions that require the world to remain diverse, mutable, and alive. Greed, in its ultimate form, is the desire to replace this complex, living world with a simplified, dead collection of owned objects. It's the failure to understand that some treasures are destroyed the moment you try to possess them. Furthermore, the story serves as a timeless warning about the isolation that unchecked avarice creates. Midas's curse is a metaphor for the way greed can build walls between a person and everyone else. Initially, his power sets him apart in a position of awe, but that isolation quickly morphs into a terrifying loneliness. He cannot share a meal, he cannot clap a friend on the back, and most tragically, he cannot touch his own child. His wealth doesn't connect him to others, it severs those connections. This reflects a profound psychological truth. An obsession with material acquisition often comes at the expense of interpersonal relationships. The time and energy devoted to amassing fortune are time and energy not spent on building and nurturing human bonds. Midas becomes a king of a kingdom of one, ruling over a silent, golden empire where there is no one to talk to, no one to love, and no one to share his triumphs or failures with. His golden touch is the ultimate symbol of self-imposed exile from the human community. Ultimately, the myth of Midas is not about the evil of gold itself, but about the danger of misplacing our priorities. It challenges us to conduct a personal audit of what we consider truly valuable. Are we, like Midas, chasing a single, shiny solution to the challenges of existence, hoping that financial security will automatically bring happiness, peace, and connection? The story reminds us that life is a delicate balance of needs and wants, of material necessities and spiritual nourishment. A successful life isn't about maximizing one area at the expense of all others. It's about cultivating a healthy ecosystem where our material well-being supports, rather than suffocates, our emotional and relational lives. The power of the myth lies in its dramatic exaggeration. We will never be cursed with a literal golden touch, but we can certainly fall into the trap of believing that if we just had a little more money, a better house, or a newer car, then our real problems would disappear. Midas's story is a cautionary tale that urges us to look beyond the glitter, to appreciate the fragile, perishable, and irreplaceable things that give life its true richness before we accidentally turn them to gold in our relentless pursuit of more. This profound shift in perspective reveals the second great theme of the myth, a lesson etched into the king's soul through the cold, metallic horror of his curse, the immeasurable value of simplicity. Having stared into the abyss of a world where everything was priceless and nothing had value, Midas emerged with a newfound, almost sacred, appreciation for the basic, unadorned elements of existence. His redemption was not just a removal of a magical affliction, it was a complete rewiring of his understanding of what makes life worth living. The man who once believed joy could be manufactured with a touch now understood that it was discovered in the absence of such power, in the humble, everyday gifts he had once taken for granted. Consider the sheer miracle of a simple meal after his purification. Where before his table groaned under the weight of golden, inedible feasts, he could now sit down to a plate of coarse bread, a piece of cheese, and a cup of water. But these were no longer just commodities to be consumed. Each bite was a symphony of sensation. The rough texture of the bread against his tongue, the way it yielded to his teeth, the subtle, earthy flavor of the grain, these were experiences more precious than any golden sculpture. The act of drinking became a ritual of gratitude. He could feel the cool liquid soothe his parched throat, a sensation of life and relief that no amount of gold could ever replicate. His wealth was no longer measured in his treasury, but in the functioning of his own body, in the simple, profound pleasure of satisfying a basic need. This is a theme that resonates on a deeply human level, far beyond the confines of the myth. How often do we, in our pursuit of more complex and exotic pleasures, overlook the fundamental joys of a warm meal when we are hungry or a cool drink when we are thirsty? Midas's story reminds us that the foundation of happiness is built upon these basic biological satisfactions. When they are guaranteed, we are already rich in the most essential currency of life. This appreciation extended far beyond the dining table and into the very fabric of the natural world. The king who had once sought to overlay nature with a veneer of gold now found his greatest solace in its unaltered state. A walk through his gardens was no longer an inspection of assets but a sensory journey. He would stop to feel the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, its solidity and age a testament to a different kind of endurance than the sterile permanence of metal. He would marvel at the vibrant, ephemeral beauty of a flower, knowing that its brief life cycle, budding, blooming, wilting, was part of its exquisite value, a quality lost the moment he tried to make it permanent. The sound of the wind rustling through leaves, the sight of a stream flowing over stones, the warmth of the sun on his skin, these were not background details to his life, they were the main event. They were experiences that required no purchase, no transformation, only his presence and attention. In this, the myth speaks to a modern audience surrounded by digital distractions and manufactured environments. It suggests that a deep, abiding contentment can be found by reconnecting with the simple, organic rhythms of the world around us, by valuing the living over the manufactured. Ultimately, the theme of simplicity finds its most powerful expression in Midas's relationships, particularly with his daughter. Before the curse, his love for her may have been expressed through lavish gifts and the privileges of her royal status. It was a love filtered through the lens of his wealth. After her restoration, every moment with her was infused with a poignant, almost painful gratitude. The simple act of holding her hand was no longer a casual gesture, it was a miracle. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers, the living, breathing reality of her presence. A conversation with her was not about affairs of state, but about her thoughts, her dreams, her childish observations, the unquantifiable currency of a shared life. The myth argues that the most valuable relationships are not those that are complicated by material exchange or status, but those that are built on the simple, direct foundation of presence, attention, and unconditional care. Midas learned that the richest man is not the one who can buy the most expensive gift, but the one who understands that the greatest gift he can offer is his own fully engaged self. In the end, his golden palace stood as a monument to a lesson learned too late, but his heart, once hardened by greed, had been softened into a vessel for the simple, profound love that truly made him a king. But what about the man behind the myth? Is there any historical truth to this unforgettable story of a king and his golden touch? The fascinating answer is yes. While the magical curse is a product of poetic imagination, King Midas was almost certainly a real historical figure. He appears not just in Greek myths, but in the records of his contemporary neighbors, the powerful Assyrian Empire. Inscriptions from the 8th century BC mention a king named Midas of Mushki, who scholars widely identify as the Midas of legend, ruling the Phrygian kingdom from his capital at Gordion, in what is now central Turkey. These ancient texts describe him as a formidable ruler, an opponent and sometimes an ally of the Assyrians, painting a picture of a powerful monarch whose influence stretched across the region. This historical Midas was no folktale caricature. He was a significant political player on the ancient world stage, a king whose real-life wealth and power were so immense that they likely seeded the legendary stories that grew around his name for centuries after his death. The most compelling evidence for this connection comes from archaeology. The ancient city of Gordion has been extensively excavated, and the discoveries there are nothing short of breathtaking. The most famous find is the so-called Tumulus or the Midas Mound, a massive earthwork tomb nearly 50 meters high. When archaeologists carefully opened this gigantic burial chamber in the 1950s, they found it miraculously intact, sealed for over 2,700 years. Inside, they discovered the body of a man in his 60s, laid out on a beautifully carved wooden bed, surrounded by an incredible collection of grave goods. While there was no gold produced by a magical touch, the tomb was far from poor. It contained a stunning array of bronze vessels, intricate wooden furniture inlaid with fine designs, and a wealth of textiles. The banquet service alone was magnificent, suggesting a belief in a lavish afterlife for a truly great king. Scientific analysis dates the tomb to around his death, making the occupant a prime candidate for the historical Midas. The sheer scale of the tomb and the quality of the artifacts speak to a kingdom of immense prosperity and sophisticated craftsmanship, a reality that perfectly sets the stage for the legendary wealth described in the myth. So how did a historical king of great wealth become the mythological king with the golden touch? The legend likely grew as an exaggeration and a folk explanation for the observable prosperity of Phrygia. The region was famous in antiquity for its rich mineral deposits, particularly gold, which was panned from its rivers, most notably the Pactolus to the Greeks, who were emerging from their own dark ages and beginning to colonize the coasts of Asia Minor. The Phrygians would have seemed incredibly wealthy. The grandeur of Gordian, the splendor of the king's court, and the flow of gold from their lands would have been the stuff of wonder and envy. It's not difficult to imagine Greek travelers and merchants returning home with tales of this fabulously rich king, stories that became embellished with each telling. Over time, the simple fact of Midas's great fortune was transformed by the Greek imagination into a supernatural ability. The myth served as a poetic answer to the question, how could one man be so rich? The answer, in the language of storytelling, was that he must have had a direct divine gift, a gift that, as these stories so often teach, came with a terrible hidden cost. The archaeological record provides an even more poignant and possible inspiration for the curse. Analysis of the organic remains found in the Midas mound tomb revealed traces of a remarkable funeral feast. Chemical analysis of the leftover food and drink residues inside the bronze cauldrons showed that the mourners consumed a spicy stew of lentils and meat, and a beverage made from a mixture of wine, beer, and mead. But beyond this feast, a more startling discovery was made. The body of the king himself showed signs of a chronic illness. Some anthropologists who have studied the remains suggest he may have suffered from a condition known as otodystrophy, a rare congenital disorder that can cause, among other things, a distinctive deformation or unusual enlargement of the ears. This presents a haunting possibility that the myth of the donkey ears, his second humiliation, might also have a basis in a physical reality. A physical trait, perhaps hidden during his life, could have been remembered and woven into the later legends as a divine punishment for his folly, adding a second, deeply personal layer to his legendary misfortune. This connection, while speculative, illustrates how myths can often be rooted in a kernel of historical truth, transforming real events and traits into powerful, eternal stories about the human condition. Yet the most profound impact of the Midas story lies not in ancient graves or poetic exaggerations, but in the very words we use today. The myth's journey into our daily language is a fascinating case of ironic simplification. We have all heard someone described as having the Midas touch, a phrase meant to compliment their uncanny ability to turn any project or investment into a success. This modern usage, however, represents a complete inversion of the original myth's cautionary message. When we say a CEO or an entrepreneur has the Midas touch, we are celebrating the very thing the story condemns, an effortless, seemingly magical talent for generating wealth. We have stripped the tale of its tragedy, its isolation, and its profound warning about the cost of such a power. The phrase focuses exclusively on the first, joyful act of the story, the creation of gold, and conveniently forgets the devastating second act of starvation and loss. In doing so, our language has performed its own kind of alchemy, transforming a lesson about the emptiness of materialism into a symbol of materialistic triumph. It is as if we have collectively chosen to remember King Midas only at the peak of his initial ecstasy, willfully ignoring the desperate, grieving father he became. This linguistic legacy is powerfully reflected in the arts, where the myth has been a source of inspiration for centuries. In painting, artists from the Renaissance onward have been drawn to the story's dramatic potential. They often depict the pivotal moment of horror, Midas at the feast, staring in disbelief at the golden food he cannot eat, or the even more heartbreaking scene where he transforms his daughter. These visual representations capture the tension between breathtaking beauty and profound tragedy. The canvases are filled with a warm, glowing gold leaf, making the scenes visually magnificent, yet the expressions on the faces of Midas and those around him tell a story of despair. The art forces us to confront the paradox head-on, presenting wealth not as a blessing but as a gilded cage. In literature, the myth has been retold and reinterpreted endlessly, from Ovid's poignant version in the Metamorphoses to modern adaptations in novels and plays. Each retelling grapples with the central theme, using Midas as our archetype for the dangers of unchecked ambition and the timeless human conflict between what we want and what we truly need. The story's structure is inherently dramatic, making it a perfect vehicle for exploring the complexities of the human soul. Moving into the 20th and 21st centuries, the myth of Midas has proven incredibly adaptable, finding new life in popular culture. It serves as a ready-made plot device in films and television shows, often used to teach a character a quick lesson about greed or the importance of family. An episode of a cartoon might feature a character who gains a Midas-like power, leading to the usual comedic chaos of golden pets and inedible meals before a moral is learned. In more serious dramas, the Midas Touch can be a metaphor for a character's corrosive success, where their financial achievements come at the expense of their personal relationships and happiness, echoing the king's isolation. Beyond direct adaptations, the themes of the story permeate our storytelling. Countless narratives revolve around a protagonist who gets exactly what they wish for, only to discover the unintended consequences. The superhero who gains immense power but loses their normal life, the businessman who earns a fortune but neglects their family, these are all modern echoes of the Midas myth. The specific magic may change, but the core warning remains as relevant as ever. Ultimately, the endurance of King Midas's story across millennia is a testament to its profound and uncomfortable truth. It resonates because it speaks to a fundamental anxiety within the human experience, particularly in a world often obsessed with wealth and success. The myth holds up a mirror to our own ambitions, asking us to consider what we might be sacrificing in our own pursuits of a golden life. Are we, in our drive for financial security or professional accolades, accidentally turning the simple, nourishing aspects of our lives into cold, static monuments to our ambition? The story does not argue that wealth is inherently evil, but rather that an obsession with it is a dangerous simplification of a complex world. The true legacy of Midas is not the phrase Midas Touch, but the lingering unease we feel when we hear it, a cultural memory of a king who learned that some things are too valuable to have a price. It is a permanent part of our cultural vocabulary because on some level we understand that the curse was not the golden touch itself, but the tragic failure to recognize that the best things in life are not made of gold, but of the very stuff the king's touch destroyed. And so, the tragic arc of King Midas is finally complete, a journey that takes us from the dizzying heights of wish fulfillment to the crushing depths of despair, and finally to a hard-won, bittersweet redemption. It begins with a seemingly generous act that earns a divine reward, a moment where the king's deepest material desire is granted without hesitation. We witness his childlike joy as he transforms his world into a glittering paradise, a euphoric high that makes the impending fall all the more devastating. The descent is swift and brutal, moving from the simple frustration of a golden meal to the soul-shattering horror of a loved one turned to a statue. His palace, a symbol of ultimate wealth, becomes a gilded tomb where he is the sole, starving inhabitant. This is the core of the tragedy, the realization that in getting everything he thought he wanted, he lost everything he actually needed. His redemption, earned through desperate prayer and a humbling pilgrimage, cleanses him of the curse but cannot erase the memory of his loss. The final chapters, with the donkey ears and the whispering reeds, add a layer of poignant irony, reminding us that some lessons must be learned repeatedly, and that the scars of our follies often remain visible long after the wounds have healed. The timeless lesson woven through this entire epic is a profound meditation on the true nature of wealth and happiness. The myth forces us to confront the dangerous illusion that material abundance is a synonym for a rich life. Midas's fatal error was his belief that by converting the complex, living world into a single, stable substance, gold, he could eliminate all worry and achieve permanent bliss. Instead, he discovered that value is not inherent in an object's composition, but in its function, its purpose, and its connection to our lived experience. A golden rose has no fragrance, a golden loaf of bread offers no sustenance. True wealth, the story argues, is found in the dynamic, often fragile ecosystem of needs and satisfactions that make us human. It is in the taste of food, the comfort of an embrace, the sound of laughter, and the beauty of a sunset, things that are precious precisely because they are transient and cannot be owned or hoarded. Happiness is not a state of permanent possession, but an ongoing process of engagement with a world that is alive, unpredictable, and beautifully imperfect. This ancient story holds up a startlingly clear mirror to our modern world, where the pursuit of financial success and material security can often feel like the primary goal of existence. We may not be able to turn things to gold with a touch, but the underlying temptation is eerily familiar. How often do we fall into the trap of believing that if we just had a little more money, a bigger house, or a more prestigious job, then our real problems would disappear? The myth of Midas warns us that this is a dangerous simplification. It cautions against a life where the pursuit of more comes at the expense of the things that truly sustain us: our relationships, our health, our connection to nature, and our sense of purpose. In an age of hyper-consumerism and digital distractions, Midas's story is a powerful call to audit our own priorities, to ask ourselves if we are, in our own way, turning the living, breathing elements of our lives into cold, static monuments to ambition. So, as we leave the gilded halls of this ancient tale, we are left with a question that is as personal as it is profound. The story of King Midas is ultimately a story about desire and its consequences. It challenges us to look inward and consider the nature of our own wishes. What if you were offered that one power, that one shortcut, that one thing you believe would solve all your problems? What would you be willing to touch, and what would you be willing to lose in your own pursuit of a golden life? We would love to hear your reflections. What does this ancient myth mean to you in the context of your own world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation about the timeless and very human tension between what we want and what we truly need.